In the harsh frontier town of Dusty Creek, where compassion died with the last honest sheriff, wealthy cattle rancher Gideon Rourke rides in expecting to buy horses. What he finds instead shocks him to his core. The town's desperate families are auctioning off their daughters to pay crushing debts. Among them stands Lena Calder, bruised but unbroken, whose only crime was defending her father's farm from greedy creditors. When the crowd falls silent and no decent man steps forward, Gideon makes a choice that will change everything. He buys her freedom, but instead of claiming ownership, he offers something this broken town has forgotten: dignity, wages, and hope. His simple act of kindness becomes a spark that ignites something powerful in the hearts of hardened people. But what happens when a town that's forgotten how to love suddenly remembers how to grieve? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered auction block still bore the stains of desperate tears when Gideon Rourke dismounted his chestnut mare in the town square of Dusty Creek. He'd ridden hard from his ranch 30 miles north, drawn by rumors of prime breeding stock being sold off by bankrupt settlers. What he hadn't expected was to witness the auctioning of human souls. The crowd dispersed in uncomfortable silence after his unprecedented purchase, leaving whispers trailing in the dust like tumbleweeds. Sheriff Hackett, a man whose badge had long since lost its shine along with his integrity, spat tobacco juice and shook his head. "Damn fool's gonna regret that charitable nonsense," he muttered to Mayor Blackwood, whose generous belly testified to his appetite for other people's misfortune. Gideon's weathered hands, scarred from decades of ranch work, and something darker he rarely spoke of, reached into his vest pocket. His fingers found the familiar weight of his silver pocket watch, a gift from his beloved Margaret on their wedding day 23 years past. The inscription still caught the light: "Time. Stand still when love is true." He'd carried it through cattle drives, harsh winters, and the longest nights of his life. Now it seemed to pulse with a warmth he'd forgotten existed. "Miss Calder," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, but tempered with a gentleness that surprised even him. "I reckon we should discuss your situation." Lena stood apart from the dissipating crowd, her calico dress torn at the shoulder, dark hair escaping from what had once been a proper bun. Her green eyes held the wariness of a cornered animal, but beneath that lay something unbreakable, a dignity that no amount of hardship could steal. She'd watched this stranger hand over more gold than most folks in Dusty Creek saw in a year, and she knew better than to trust easy generosity. "What exactly do you expect from me, Mr. Rourke?" Her voice carried traces of education, refinement that spoke of better days. "Because if you think I expect honest work for honest wages," Gideon interrupted, not unkindly. "Nothing more, nothing less. My ranch runs cattle, horses, and crops. Could use someone who knows their way around all three. Pays $2 a week plus room and board in the small cabin behind the main house. Sundays off for church or whatever suits your conscience." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Around them, Dusty Creek continued its daily struggle with dignity. Mrs. Henderson clutched her remaining children closer, knowing her own circumstances teetered on the same precipice that had claimed Lena. Young Tom Miller watched from the mercantile, a doorway, his father's debts mounting like storm clouds on his family's horizon. "Why?" Lena's question cut through the afternoon heat. "Why would you do such a thing for a stranger?" Gideon's thumb traced the smooth surface of his pocket watch. How could he explain that Margaret's dying words had been about the importance of kindness? How her loss had carved out his heart, leaving him a successful but hollow man who'd forgotten the weight of human connection? How seeing Lena on that block had awakened something he'd thought permanently buried with his wife and stillborn son? "Sometimes a man gets tired of watching the world forget its manners," he said finally. "Sometimes he decides to remind folks what decency looks like." Banker Cyrus Wickham emerged from the crowd's shadows, his pale eyes calculating, At 45, he'd grown rich on other people's desperation, financing their dreams at rates that guaranteed eventual foreclosure. Lena's father had been one of his victims, and he'd orchestrated today's auction as both punishment and entertainment. "Mighty generous of you, Rourke," Wickham said, his voice oily with false friendliness. "Though I wonder what your neighbors will think of such unconventional arrangements." "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Wickham." Gideon's tone could freeze summer rain. "Miss Calder's employment is between her and me." As the two men faced each other, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew of Gideon Rourke's reputation. Fair in his dealings, but deadly serious about his principles. They also knew Wickham's power came from the desperate grip he held on their mortgages and debts. Lena watched this exchange with growing understanding. Her rescue hadn't been random charity. It was a declaration of war against everything that had brought Dusty Creek to its knees. And somehow, she'd become both the battlefield and the prize. "I accept your offer, Mr. Rourke," she said quietly, her decision settling over the square like dust after a storm. The ride to Gideon's ranch passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the rhythmic creak of leather saddles and the distant call of meadowlarks. Lena sat astride the gentle mare he'd provided, her posture straight despite the bruises blooming purple along her ribs. Souvenirs from her futile attempt to prevent the bank's seizure of her father's property. Hidden in a worn leather satchel, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay the deed to the Calder homestead. Her father, Jonas Calder, had been a man of principle in a world increasingly short on such luxuries. The document bore his careful signature, dated just 6 months before his death from pneumonia. It represented everything Wickham had stolen. Through legal manipulation and forged amendments to loan agreements, Papa always said this land would be mine someday. She'd whispered to herself during the long nights after his funeral, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers. The deed proved ownership free and clear, but in a town where the banker and sheriff shared whiskey and profits, such proof meant less than morning mist. Gideon's ranch spread across the valley like a testament to honest prosperity. White-painted, fences enclosed pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and the 2-story house spoke of comfort earned through decades of hard work. Behind it, exactly as promised, stood a small but well-maintained cabin with windows that caught the afternoon. "Light like welcoming eyes. This was built for my foreman," Gideon explained as he helped her down from the mare. "Been empty since Charlie moved on to Oregon last spring. Should suit your needs well enough." The interior surprised her with its thoughtful appointments. A stone fireplace, shelves for books, a writing desk by the window, and a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove that would keep the space warm through mountain winters. Someone had even left wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, their purple blooms adding unexpected cheer. "The main house has a proper washroom," Gideon continued, hat in hand, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "You're welcome to use it mornings and evenings. Meals we'll figure out as we go. Either you're welcome at my table, or I can arrange supplies for you to cook your own." Lena touched the faded bruise on her cheek, where Wickham's hired man had struck her during the property seizure. The memory of that day still burned, watching helplessly as they loaded her father's furniture onto wagons, jeering at her protests, treating her like property to be disposed of rather than a grieving daughter defending her inheritance. "Why didn't you just leave me there?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "You could have bought horses, minded your own business, ridden home to your comfortable life." Gideon's grey eyes, weathered by years of squinting into prairie. Sun studied her face with unexpected gentleness. "My comfortable life isn't as comfortable as it appears, Miss Calder. Sometimes a man realizes he's been sleepwalking through his days, going through motions without purpose." She sensed depths in his words that went beyond simple explanation, but pride prevented her from pressing further. Instead, she set her satchel on the desk and began the careful process of making this strange new space her own. That evening, as lamplight flickered through the cabin windows, Lena sat at the writing desk and carefully unfolded her father's deed. The legal language seemed to mock her with its formal promises. Fee simple absolute, heirs and assigns forever, free and clear of all encumbrances. Pretty words that meant nothing when the man holding your mortgage could forge signatures and backdate amendments. Through her window, she could see Gideon on his porch, reading by lamplight, occasionally glancing toward her cabin, as if reassuring himself of her presence. His kindness felt too good to be true, and her experience had taught her that such gifts always came with hidden costs. The town's reaction had been predictable. On their ride through Dusty Creek's main street, she'd seen the mixture of envy, suspicion, and outright hostility in familiar faces. Mrs. Patterson had pursed her lips in disapproval. The merchant wives had whispered behind their hands. Even some who'd known her father well seemed to question her character rather than celebrate her rescue. Putting on airs, she'd heard someone mutter, acting like she's better than her circumstances. But it was the children's faces that haunted her most. Hollow-cheeked youngsters whose parents faced the same impossible choices hers had. How many more auctions would this town endure before someone besides Gideon Rourke decided to make a stand? Sleep came fitfully that first night, filled with dreams of auction blocks and her father's disappointed ghost asking why she'd accepted charity instead of fighting for justice. She woke before dawn, muscles aching from tension and unaccustomed. Horseback riding, but with resolution hardening in her chest like cooling iron. Whatever game the people of Dusty Creek were playing, whatever corruption festered in their institutions, she would not be merely a grateful recipient of one man's kindness. She would earn her place here, prove her worth, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, find a way to reclaim what had been stolen from her family's legacy. Dawn came to the Rourke ranch with the gentle persistence of hope itself. Lena woke to the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures and the melodic chaos of roosters announcing another day's possibilities. Through her cabin window, she watched Gideon emerge from the main house, coffee mug in hand, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who'd built something lasting through honest effort. She'd been working for him 3 days now, and already the routine felt more natural than the chaos of her recent past. There was something deeply satisfying about meaningful work, mending fence lines, tending to injured animals, organizing the grain stores, that reminded her of the purposeful life she'd known before her father's death. This morning, however, brought visitors. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of riders, and Lena recognized the bearing of men accustomed to authority. As they drew closer, she could make out Sheriff Morrison from the county seat, accompanied by 2 other ranchers whose spreads adjoined Gideon's property. "Gideon!" Sheriff Morrison called out, dismounting near the main house. Unlike Dusty Creek's corrupt Hackett, Morrison was a man whose badge still meant something. "Heard some interesting stories about your recent trip to town." Gideon sat down, his coffee mug, and walked out to meet them, his movements unhurried but alert. Lena continued her work feeding the chickens, but positioned herself where she could hear the conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. "Jim." Gideon nodded to the sheriff, then acknowledged the other men. "Pete, Nathaniel, what brings you out this way?" Pete Garrison, whose Bar G ranch sprawled across the next valley, removed his hat and mopped his brow. "Well, Gideon, we've been hearing some peculiar tales. Word is you bought yourself a woman at auction down in Dusty Creek." The words hung in the morning air like gunsmoke. Lena's hands stilled on the chicken feed, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment she'd been dreading, when Gideon's act of kindness would be reduced to crude speculation and judgment. "Is that what they're saying?" Gideon's voice remained level, but Lena caught the dangerous undertone that had made Banker Wickham step back. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. "Now, Gideon, we all know you're a man of integrity, but some folks are wondering about the propriety of the situation. Young woman living alone on your property." "She's my employee," Gideon said simply. "Has her own cabin, earns her own wages, works harder than any 3 men I've hired in recent years. Nathaniel Cobb, the youngest of the three visitors, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "It's just, well, people talk, Gideon, and with your reputation in these parts—" "What about my reputation?" The question carried enough frost to make summer grass wither. Lena found herself holding her breath, realizing she knew remarkably little about the man who'd rescued her. She'd assumed his prosperity came from shrewd cattle trading and careful ranch management, but the tension in the air suggested deeper currents. Morrison exchanged glances with the other men before speaking carefully. "We all remember what happened during the Indian Troubles 5 years back, how you handled those raiders who were hitting the smaller spreads. Word was you'd learned some hard lessons during your army days." Gideon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That was a long time ago, Jim. Not so long that folks have forgotten," Pete added quietly. "You saved a lot of lives, prevented a lot of suffering, but the way you went about it, well, it reminded people that Gideon Rourke isn't a man to cross lightly." Inside the main house, tucked away in Gideon's bedroom bureau, lay a faded daguerreotype that told a story he'd shared with no living soul. The image showed a younger version of himself in Union cavalry uniform, standing beside a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret held their infant son, Thomas, who'd lived only 3 months before succumbing to the fever that claimed so many frontier children. The photograph bore the weight of his greatest failures, his inability to protect those he loved most, the darkness that military service had carved into his soul, the way grief had transformed him from a hopeful young husband into a man others respected but kept at careful distance. Lena had discovered the truth accidentally that morning while helping organize his cluttered study. Among the scattered papers and ranch ledgers, she'd found military commendations that spoke of exceptional valor under fire and tactical brilliance in asymmetric warfare. The formal language couldn't hide what they really described: a man who'd learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. But it was the personal letter tucked between the official documents that had stopped her breath. Written in a woman's careful script, it began, "My dearest Gideon, if you're reading this, then the fever has taken me as we feared. Promise me you won't let the darkness swallow you completely. There's still so much love in your heart." The letter continued for 3 pages. Margaret's final words to the husband she'd known would struggle to find purpose after losing everything that mattered. She'd begged him to remember kindness, to help others when he could, to believe that love might find him again if he remained open to its possibility. "Gentlemen," Gideon said finally, drawing Lena back to the present conversation, "I appreciate your concern, but Miss Calder's employment is legitimate, necessary, and completely proper. If anyone has questions about that, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly." The finality in his tone suggested the conversation was over, but Sheriff Morrison pressed gently forward. "Just be careful, Gideon. There are forces in Dusty Creek that don't appreciate your interference in their affairs. Wickham's been making noise about outside agitators disrupting the natural order of things." "The natural order," Gideon repeated, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "shouldn't include selling human beings to pay fabricated debts." As the visitors prepared to leave, Pete Garrison offered one final observation. "You're walking a narrow path, friend. Hope you know what you're doing." After they'd ridden away, Gideon stood alone in his yard for a long moment, lost in thoughts Lena couldn't fathom. When he finally looked toward her cabin, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw something that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. A man carrying the weight of old sorrows, trying to build something good from the ruins of his past. 2 weeks into her employment at the Rourke Ranch, Lena had established a rhythm that felt like the first stable ground she'd known since her father's death. Each morning brought purposeful work, checking cattle for signs of illness, maintaining the vegetable garden that supplied the ranch kitchen, and learning the intricate art of horse training under Gideon's patient guidance. It was during one of these quiet morning routines that she noticed something tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin, something the previous occupant had left behind. Wrapped in soft leather was a hand-carved wooden cross, no bigger than her palm, crafted from what appeared to be pine. The workmanship spoke of love and careful attention, each curve smoothed by countless hours of devoted carving. She recognized it immediately as her father's work. Jonas Calder had been known throughout the territory for his skill with wood, creating everything from furniture to intricate decorative pieces. This cross, however, was different, personal, intimate, meant for private devotion rather than public display. On its back, carved in her father's careful script, were the words, "For my beloved Lena, that faith might sustain you when I cannot." The discovery left her sitting on her cabin floor, tears flowing freely for the first time since the auction. Her father had somehow known this day would come, had prepared for her eventual displacement from their home. The cross represented not just his faith, but his faith in her, his belief that she would survive whatever trials lay ahead. That afternoon, while organizing supplies in the ranch's main barn, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Mrs. Abernathy, the widow who lived on the struggling homestead adjacent to town, was speaking quietly with Gideon near the corral. "I hate to trouble you, Mr. Rourke," the elderly woman was saying, her voice heavy with shame, "but I'm afraid I'll lose the place by month's end. The bank's demanding payment I simply don't have." Gideon listened with the careful attention he gave to all serious matters. "How much are we talking about, Mrs. Abernathy?" $47, she whispered, as if speaking the sum aloud might somehow make it larger. "Might as well be 400 for all the chance I have of raising it." Lena watched from the shadows as Gideon reached into his vest pocket, not for his pocket watch this time, but for a leather pouch that clinked softly with coins. Without ceremony or fanfare, he counted out the money and pressed it into the widow's weathered hands. "Consider it a loan," he said gently, though they both knew he expected no repayment. "Pay it back when you're able, or don't. Sometimes a person just needs a little breathing room to find their footing again." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. "God bless you, Mr. Rourke. I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary. We all need help, from time to time." After the widow left, clutching her salvation in trembling hands, Lena emerged from the barn. Gideon looked slightly embarrassed at being caught in his act of kindness, as if generosity were somehow shameful. "She's not the first, is she?" Lena asked softly. Gideon removed his hat and ran fingers through greying hair. "Wickham's been tightening the screws on half the county, calling in loans, raising interest rates, foreclosing on properties that families have worked for generations. Someone needs to push back." "Is that what you're doing? Pushing back?" "I'm doing what Margaret would have wanted me to do," he said simply, and Lena understood he was referring to the woman in the photograph she'd glimpsed. She always said a man's wealth isn't measured by what he accumulates, but by what he's willing to share. Word of Mrs. Abernathy's mysterious good fortune spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire, though the widow herself was careful never to reveal her benefactor's identity. By the following Sunday, similar stories began to emerge. The Miller family's grocery debt mysteriously paid, the Hendersons' medical bills settled anonymously, young couples finding wedding funds that appeared like answered prayers. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. People who hadn't spoken kindly to neighbors in years began offering help with harvests and barn repairs. The mercantile owner started extending credit to struggling families without charging usurious interest. Children playing in the streets seemed to laugh more freely, sensing the subtle shift in their community's spirit. But it was at Sunday service that Lena truly witnessed the transformation beginning to take hold. She and Gideon had started attending together, a development that raised eyebrows, but also seemed to give others permission to hope for their own second chances. Reverend Phillips, a man who'd grown timid under years of pressure from the town's corrupt elite, delivered a sermon about the widow's might with unusual passion. "Sometimes," he declared from his pulpit, "God works through unexpected vessels to remind us of our duty to one another." Sometimes the greatest among us are those who lift others without seeking recognition or reward. After the service, as the congregation lingered in the churchyard sharing news and conversation, Lena noticed something remarkable. People were looking directly at each other again, making eye contact, engaging in genuine fellowship rather than the suspicious whispers that had characterized the town for so long. Young Tom Miller approached them hesitantly, hat in hand. "Mr. Rourke, sir, I don't know if it was you who helped my family, but whoever it was, well, Pa says to tell you he's available for any work you might need, no charge. Says it's the least he can do." Similar offers came throughout the afternoon, people eager to contribute to whatever force was healing their community. Gideon accepted some offers graciously while deflecting personal credit, but Lena could see the satisfaction in his eyes. His calculated acts of kindness were achieving something beyond mere charity. They were awakening the dormant conscience of an entire town. That evening, as she held her father's wooden cross and watched lamplight flicker in Gideon's study window, Lena realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. One man's decision to act with deliberate compassion was proving that goodness, like corruption, could spread through a community with unstoppable momentum. For the first time since her father's death, she dared to hope that justice might be more than just a beautiful dream. The transformation of Dusty Creek didn't happen overnight, but by the end of the month, even the most skeptical residents couldn't deny that something fundamental had shifted in their community's soul. What had begun with Gideon's rescue of Lena and his quiet acts of charity had blossomed into a movement of mutual aid that touched nearly every family in town. Reverend Phillips found himself at the center of this awakening, though he'd spent years avoiding any stance that might offend the powerful men who controlled the town's purse strings. His worn Bible, leather cracked from decades of faithful use, but spine strengthened by renewed purpose, had become the symbol of the community's spiritual resurrection. The good book had gathered dust on his shelf for too long while he preached. Safe, meaningless sermons that challenged no one and inspired nothing. "Brethren," he declared from his pulpit on this particular Sunday, his voice carrying conviction that had been absent for years, "we have been witnesses to miracles in our midst, not the kind that part sees or raise the dead, but the everyday miracles of human kindness that remind us who we're called to be." The church was fuller than it had been in living memory. Families who'd stopped attending during the worst of their struggles had returned, drawn by stories of hope and practical assistance. Mrs. Abernathy sat in the front pew, her face radiant with the relief of a woman who'd faced homelessness and found salvation. The Miller children wore new shoes, their parents' gratitude evident in every careful step down the aisle, but it was the back pews that told the real story of change. Young couples who'd postponed marriages due to financial hardship now made wedding plans, encouraged by the community support they'd witnessed. Elderly residents who'd isolated themselves in shame over their poverty ventured out to share meals and conversation. Even some of the town's more successful citizens, inspired by the anonymous generosity they'd observed, began contributing to the growing network of mutual assistance. Gideon and Lena sat together in a middle pew, their regular attendance having evolved from social necessity to genuine spiritual hunger. Lena noticed how Gideon's fingers absently traced his pocket watch during prayers, as if drawing strength from his connection to Margaret's memory. She'd begun to understand that his acts of kindness weren't just charity, they were a form of communion with the wife who'd shaped his moral compass. After the service, as the congregation gathered in the churchyard for their weekly fellowship, the extent of the community's transformation became even more apparent. Sarah Henderson organized a quilting circle to provide blankets for families facing the approaching winter. Tom Miller announced the formation of a volunteer crew to help with harvest work for elderly residents. The mercantile owner, inspired by the anonymous debt payments he'd witnessed, established a credit system that charged fair interest rather than predatory rates. But perhaps most significant was the conversation taking place near the church steps, where a group of townspeople discussed something that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier: collective action against the corruption that had strangled their community for so long. "We can't keep pretending Wickham's practices are legitimate. Business," declared Pete Morrison, the blacksmith whose own shop had barely survived the banker's manipulations. "The way he's been doctoring loan documents, charging illegal fees, foreclosing on properties he has no right to claim. It's thievery, pure and simple." Martha Crenshaw, the schoolteacher who'd watched too many of her students drop out to work, off family debts, nodded emphatically. "And Sheriff Hackett's been complicit in every bit of it. When the bank forecloses, who enforces the evictions? When families protest, who silences them?" The discussion might have remained mere complaint, if not for an unexpected voice joining the conversation. Dr. Marcus Webb, who'd maintained careful neutrality throughout the town's troubles, stepped forward with documents in his weathered medical. "I've been keeping records," he announced quietly, producing a leather-bound journal. "Every suspicious death, every family driven to desperation, every child who's suffered because of artificial poverty created by these men's greed. If we're going to make accusations, we need evidence that will stand up to outside scrutiny." The revelation that their respected physician had been secretly documenting the town's suffering galvanized the group. Here was a man whose medical oath had compelled him to witness and record the human cost of corruption, even when he felt powerless to intervene directly. Lena watched this development with growing excitement, but also with concern. She could see Banker Wickham and Sheriff Hackett observing the gathering from across the street, their expressions dark with suspicion and anger. The corrupt officials had profited too long from the town's despair to surrender their power without a fight. "We need to be careful," she murmured to Gideon as they walked home from church. "They won't take this challenge lightly." Gideon's hand rested briefly on the butt of the Colt revolver he wore beneath his jacket, a habit from his military days that had proven useful during the Indian troubles. "I'm counting on it," he said grimly. "Sometimes the only way to clean out corruption is to force it into the open, where decent people can see it clearly." That afternoon, as Lena tended to her small garden behind the cabin, she reflected on how dramatically her circumstances had changed. A month ago, she'd been a desperate woman facing auction as payment for fabricated debts. Now, she was part of a community awakening to its own power, working alongside a man whose quiet strength had sparked a revolution of human decency. The wooden cross her father had carved rested on her windowsill, catching the afternoon light. Its simple presence reminded her that faith wasn't just about believing in divine intervention. Sometimes it meant having the courage to become the answer to someone else's prayers. As evening shadows lengthened across the ranch, Lena made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop being merely grateful for her rescue and start actively fighting for justice. Her father's stolen land, the forged documents, the manufactured debts that had destroyed so many families. These crimes couldn't remain hidden forever. Tomorrow, she would share her father's deed with Dr. Webb and the other townspeople. It was time for Dusty Creek to learn that some fights were worth having, even against seemingly impossible odds. The storm that had been building over Dusty Creek finally broke on a Tuesday evening, when Lena discovered Gideon standing in his study, staring at an ornate cavalry sword mounted above his desk. The weapon gleamed despite its age, its brass hilt polished to mirror brightness, the steel blade etched with the insignia of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry Regiment. "I haven't touched that in 5 years," Gideon said without turning around, somehow sensing her presence in the doorway. "Told myself I'd never need it again." Lena stepped into the room, her eyes taking in details she'd missed during her brief earlier visit. Military commendations lined one wall, but it was the sword that dominated the space, not as decoration, but as a reminder of capabilities he'd hoped to leave buried. The Indian troubles Sheriff Morrison mentioned, she said carefully. It was more than just defending your neighbors, wasn't it? Gideon's laugh held no humor. I suppose you could say that. When the Kiowa and Comanche started raiding the smaller homesteads, the territorial government was slow to respond, too busy with politics in Denver to care about scattered farm families getting butchered in their beds. He turned to face her. Then, and Lena saw something in his eyes she'd never glimpsed before, the shadow of a man who'd made peace with necessary violence. So we formed our own militia. 27 men who knew these hills and valleys better than any army scout. I'd had experience with asymmetric warfare during the rebellion, knew how to turn terrain into advantage. The sword had been his grandfather's. Carried through campaigns against hostile tribes in the 1840s, passed down to a family that understood the sometimes brutal requirements of frontier survival. But in Gideon's hands, it had become something different. A tool of calculated justice rather than conquest. We didn't just drive them off, he continued quietly. We tracked them back to their winter camps, hit them where they felt safe, made sure they understood that raiding our territory would cost them more than they could afford to lose. Lena moved closer, studying the etchings on the blade. Among the standard military markings, she could make out small notches carved into the steel, not decorative but functional. A record of encounters that had required more than negotiation to resolve. How many? She asked. Enough. The finality in his voice closed that particular door, but Lena understood the weight he carried. She'd seen similar haunted looks in her father's eyes when he spoke of the war, the moral compromises that survival sometimes demanded. After Margaret died, Gideon continued, his voice softening, I thought about joining her, not through any dramatic gesture, but just letting myself fade away, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. He moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful valley that had cost so much blood to secure. She used to say that grief was love with nowhere to go, that the only way to honor what we'd lost was to find new ways to love, new purposes worth fighting for. Lena thought of her own father, of the principles he'd died defending, the legacy of integrity that had made her a target for corrupt men's greed. Papa always said that some things were worth more than safety, that a person's character was measured, not by what they could avoid, but by what they chose to face. Wise man, your father. I wish I'd known him. You would have liked each other. He believed in fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. That evening, as they shared dinner at Gideon's table, a routine that had developed naturally over the past weeks, Lena finally revealed the secret she'd been carrying. With careful ceremony, she placed her father's deed on the wooden surface. Between them, this is why they really wanted me gone, she said simply. Not just to satisfy a debt, but to eliminate the only person who could prove Wickham's been stealing land through forged documents. Gideon studied the deed with the careful attention of a man accustomed to legal documents. His eyes grew hard as he noted the discrepancies between the original text and the obvious alterations that had been made to support Wickham's false claims. This is evidence of federal crimes, he said finally. Land fraud, forgery, conspiracy. If the territorial authorities saw this, if they believed it, Lena corrected. Wickham has connections throughout the territory. Money talks louder than justice in most government offices. Gideon's hand moved unconsciously toward the cavalry sword in the next room. Then we'll have to make sure they listen with their hearts instead of their wallets. The conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Dr. Webb stood on the porch, his medical bag in one hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. We have a problem, he announced without preamble. The Henderson boy, Little. Timothy, he's been beaten severely. Claims it was Hackett's deputies sent to deliver a message about interfering in bank business. The three adults stood in the lamplight, understanding that their community's awakening had finally provoked the violent response they'd all feared. The time for quiet charity and gentle pressure had passed. Now they faced a choice between submission and open resistance. Gideon's eyes found his cavalry sword again, and Lena saw him mentally calculating odds, terrain advantages, tactical options. The peaceful rancher was transforming back into the strategic mind that had once terrorized hostile war parties across hundreds of miles of wilderness. "How bad is the boy hurt?" he asked Dr. Webb. "He'll live, but barely." They wanted him to suffer, wanted his family to see what happens to people who accept help from the wrong sources. Lena felt something crystallize in her chest, a resolve that went beyond personal grievance to embrace communal justice. Then it's time they learned what happens to people who hurt children in front of their neighbors. The brass collection. Plate hadn't held more than a few copper pennies in months, but that Sunday morning it sat heavy in Reverend Phillips's trembling hands, not with coins, but with the weight of moral responsibility he'd avoided for far too long. The ornate vessel, donated by the church's founding families 20 years prior, had become a symbol of spiritual poverty, as barren as the community it was meant to serve. Word of Timothy Henderson's beating had spread through Dusty Creek like wildfire, and the church was packed with people seeking answers, comfort, or simply the solidarity of shared outrage. The boy sat in the front pew beside his parents, his face purple with bruises, his left arm in a sling fashioned from Dr. Webb's medical supplies. Every eye in the congregation could see what happened to families who dared accept help from the wrong sources. Reverend Phillips stood at his pulpit, studying the faces before him. For 3 years, he delivered safe sermons about abstract virtues while avoiding any topic that might offend Banker Wickham or Sheriff Hackett, both of whom sat prominently in their usual pew, watching him with barely concealed menace. They'd made their expectations clear after his first attempt to address the town's growing desperation: stick to salvation and leave earthly justice to earthly authorities. But looking at Timothy Henderson's battered face, at the fear in his mother's eyes, at the quiet rage building in his congregation's hearts, the Reverend understood that silence had become complicity. His worn Bible lay open before him to the passage he'd originally planned to preach, a gentle meditation on patience and endurance. Instead, he found himself turning to different verses, words that had gathered dust while his courage had withered. "My friends," he began, his voice stronger than it had been in years, "we gather today in the shadow of violence perpetrated against the innocent. Some would have us believe that this is simply the natural order of things, that the powerful may do as they please with the powerless, that might makes right, that God's children should suffer in silence while earthly authorities pursue their own interests." A murmur ran through the congregation. This was not the careful, politically neutral message they'd grown accustomed to hearing. Sheriff Hackett shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun at his hip. "But I tell you this morning that such thinking is not merely wrong, it is blasphemous. For what does Scripture teach us about our duty to the oppressed, to the widow, to the fatherless?" The Reverend's eyes found Lena in the congregation, sitting beside Gideon, her own father's memory fresh in his mind. Then he looked at Mrs. Abernathy, whose salvation from homelessness had sparked the community's transformation. Finally, his gaze settled on young Timothy Henderson, whose suffering had become the catalyst for this moment of reckoning. The prophet Isaiah tells us, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Not suggest justice when convenient, not seek righteousness when profitable, but defend the oppressed as a sacred duty." The collection plate in his hands seemed to pulse with possibility. How many months had it remained empty while families went hungry? How many Sundays had he passed it through the congregation, knowing that most people had nothing to give because corrupt officials had taken everything they possessed? Some of you may wonder why I speak so boldly today when I've been silent for so long. The truth is, I have been a coward. I have allowed fear of earthly consequences to override my obligation to heavenly commands. I have watched good people suffer while I protected my own comfort and security. Banker Wickham's face had grown red with anger, but he remained seated, perhaps understanding that any attempt to silence the preacher now would only confirm everything being said from the pulpit. But no more. When children are beaten for their parents' acceptance of Christian charity, when families are driven from their homes through forged documents and illegal seizures, when the powerful prey upon the powerless with impunity, that is when the church must remember that Jesus himself drove the money changers from the temple with righteous anger. The Reverend set down his Bible and lifted the empty collection plate high above his head, where every person in the congregation could see its barren surface. This plate has remained empty not because this community lacks generosity, but because certain men have stolen the very means by which generosity might flourish. Today, we fill it not with coins, but with commitment. I ask each of you to place in this plate your pledge to stand together against the corruption that has poisoned our town. What followed was unprecedented in the church's history. One by one, members of the congregation came forward, not with money they didn't have, but with written promises of mutual support. Dr. Webb pledged his medical services to any family threatened for standing up to injustice. The mercantile owner promised credit for essential supplies. Young men offered their labor for families facing eviction, but it was Martha Crenshaw, the school teacher, who provided the most significant contribution. She approached the altar with a leather satchel full of documents, records she'd been secretly maintaining of every family driven from the territory by Wickham's manipulations, every child forced from school to work off manufactured debts, every suspicious death that coincided with property transfers. "I've been documenting everything," she announced to the congregation. "Names, dates, amounts, witnesses. If we're going to fight this corruption, we need evidence that will stand up in a federal court." As the collection plate filled with pledges of resistance rather than coins of tribute, Reverend Phillips felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the presence of divine approval. His congregation was transforming before his eyes from a gathering of frightened individuals into a community united by moral purpose. But it was Gideon who provided the final element their movement needed. Rising from his pew, he addressed the congregation with the authority of a man accustomed to leading others into dangerous territory. "Friends, we've made our intentions clear today. But we should understand that Wickham and Hackett won't surrender their power without a fight. They've already shown they're willing to hurt children to maintain control. Are we prepared for what comes next?" The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. They were no longer just talking about charity or community support. They were discussing open resistance to entrenched corruption, with all the risks such resistance entailed. It was Timothy Henderson who broke the silence, rising from his seat despite his injuries. "Mr. Rourke, sir, they beat me to scare everybody else, but I ain't scared. And if a 10-year-old boy ain't scared, then grown folks shouldn't be neither." The boy's courage shamed every adult in the room and crystallized their resolve. One way or another, the reign of terror in Dusty Creek was about to end. 3 days after Reverend Phillips' revolutionary sermon, Gideon stood alone in his bedroom, holding the simple gold band he'd worn for over 20 years. The ring had never left his finger since Margaret placed it there on their wedding day. Not through war, cattle drives, or the darkest nights of grief. It had become part of him, a physical reminder of promises kept and love eternally honored. But now, as evening light filtered through his window and cast long shadows across the room where he'd spent too many lonely years, Gideon understood that holding on to the past had become a barrier to embracing the future. Margaret's final letter, reread countless times in moments of doubt, echoed in his memory. "Promise me you won't let the darkness swallow you completely. There's still so much love in your heart." With hands that had steadied under enemy fire, but now trembled with emotional uncertainty, he slowly worked the ring from his finger. The pale band of skin beneath told the story of decades of faithful wearing, but also of a life that had remained suspended in memory rather than moving forward with hope. Outside, he could see Lena working in the vegetable garden, her movements efficient and purposeful as she prepared the soil for winter planting. Over the past weeks, he'd watched her transform from a desperate woman accepting charity into a confident partner in both ranch work and community resistance. Her strength wasn't the brittle hardness of someone trying to survive, but the flexible resilience of someone choosing to thrive despite circumstances. She'd been different since revealing her father's deed, more open about her own dreams and fears. The previous evening, they'd sat on his porch, discussing plans for expanding the ranch's operations, and Gideon had found himself talking about possibilities rather than just maintaining what already existed. For the first time in years, he was thinking about building something new instead of simply preserving what remained. The conversation had naturally drifted to more personal territory. Lena had shared stories of her childhood with Lena Calder, painting pictures of a man whose integrity had been both his greatest strength and the source of his ultimate downfall. Gideon had found himself reciprocating with memories of Margaret, not the painful recollections of loss that usually accompanied her name, but joyful remembrances of their shared dreams and quiet moments of happiness. "She would have liked you," he'd told Lena as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. Margaret always said the measure of a person wasn't in their circumstances, but in how they chose to respond to those circumstances. "I think I would have liked her too," Lena had replied softly. "Anyone who could inspire such loyalty and kindness in their husband must have been remarkable." Now, ring in hand, Gideon made his way outside to where Lena knelt among the rows of vegetables. She looked up at his approach, noting immediately the change in his demeanor. Her eyes went to his left hand, where the pale circle of skin was clearly visible. "Gideon," she said quietly, rising to her feet and brushing soil from her hands. He held out the ring, letting her see the inscription that had guided his moral compass for so many years. "Margaret wanted me to remember that love doesn't end with death. It finds new expressions, new purposes, new recipients worthy of its gift." Lena's breath caught as she understood the significance of this moment. The practical partnership that had developed between them over the past weeks had been building towards something deeper, but neither had dared to name it directly. The attraction had been there from the beginning, in stolen glances across the dinner table, in the way they naturally moved together during ranch work, in conversations that lasted long into the evening hours. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Gideon stepped closer and cupped her face gently in his work-roughened hands. The kiss that followed was tender but certain, carrying the weight of two people who'd found unexpected hope in each other's company. When they separated, both were breathing unsteadily. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he admitted. "After Margaret died, I convinced myself that kind of happiness was a young man's privilege, something I'd used up and could never reclaim." Lena's fingers traced the line of his jaw, marveling at the softness she found in a man whose reputation spoke of steel and determination. "I never thought I'd trust anyone enough to risk loving them. After watching Papa fight alone against impossible odds, I decided independence was safer than partnership. And now I think maybe the best partnerships are forged by people who've learned they're strong enough to stand alone, but wise enough to choose not to. They might have remained lost in that perfect moment if not for the sound of approaching horses." Dr. Webb and Martha Crenshaw rode into the yard with urgency written across their faces, their arrival scattering the intimate atmosphere like leaves before a storm. "Gideon, Lena," Dr. Webb called out as he dismounted quickly. "We need to talk." Wickham's made his move. Martha produced a legal document from her saddlebag, her school teacher's precision evident in how carefully she handled the papers. "He's Filed papers with the territorial court claiming fraud in your purchase of Lena at the auction. Says the whole transaction was invalid because she was sold under false pretenses. What false pretenses? Lena demanded, though she already suspected the answer. He's claiming you weren't actually in debt, that your father's obligations were legally satisfied before his death, making your auction illegal. But here's the clever part. He's simultaneously filing to recover the stolen property that should have reverted to the bank, meaning your father's land. Gideon's military mind immediately grasped the tactical brilliance of Wickham's strategy. By challenging the auction's legality, the banker could invalidate Gideon's claim to have legitimately purchased Lena's freedom, while simultaneously arguing that her family's debts remained unsatisfied, justifying seizure of the very property whose deed she possessed. He's trying to make her a fugitive, Gideon said grimly. If the auction was illegal, then she's technically still property of her father's estate, which he controls through the debt mechanism. Dr. Webb nodded gravely. Worse than that, he's convinced Judge Morrison in the county seat to issue a warrant. Aid for both of you, Lena for fraud and theft, you for conspiracy and harboring a fugitive. The romantic moment that had seemed to promise new beginnings now felt like a cruel joke. Just as they'd found the courage to reach for happiness, the corrupt system they'd challenged was striking back with legal weapons designed to destroy everything they'd built together. But as Lena looked at the gold ring still resting in Gideon's palm, she felt not despair, but determination. Love, she realized, wasn't just about finding joy in peaceful moments. It was about choosing to fight for that joy when it came under attack. When do they come for us? She asked quietly. Tomorrow morning, most likely, Martha replied. The warrant was issued today. Gideon closed his fingers around the wedding ring, understanding that their choice was no longer between love and independence, but between love and survival. Either way, they would face whatever came next together. The forged document arrived at dawn, delivered by one of Wickham's hired men, who rode away before anyone could examine it closely. Gideon studied the official-looking papers by lamplight in his kitchen, his experienced eye immediately catching the telltale signs of fabrication that would fool most honest citizens, but not a man who dealt with military intelligence during wartime. The fake deed bore an impressive territorial seal and judge's signature, claiming that Gideon's ranch, all 3,000 acres of it, had been purchased with stolen funds and was therefore subject to immediate seizure. According to the document, his cattle business had been built on money embezzled from army payrolls during his military service, making every transaction since his discharge fraudulent. They're not even trying to make it believable, Lena observed, pointing to discrepancies in the dates and signatures. This judge supposedly signed it yesterday, but he's been dead for 6 months. I remember Papa reading his obituary in the territorial paper. Dr. Webb, who had spent the night at the ranch after bringing news of the warrants, examined the document with professional skepticism. Wickham's getting desperate. This level of obvious fraud suggests he's running out of time for subtle manipulation. Or he's confident that nobody will challenge it, Gideon said grimly, understanding the deeper implications. If the territorial marshal arrives with federal backing, most folks won't question the paperwork. They'll just see official seals and assume legitimacy. Martha Crenshaw had been working through the night, organizing the evidence they'd collected over the past weeks. Her schoolteacher's methodical approach had produced a devastating catalogue of Wickham's crimes. Forged signatures, backdated amendments to loan agreements, property seizures based on manufactured defaults, and systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned his practices. We have enough evidence to hang him in any honest court, she declared, spreading documents across Gideon's dining table. But that's assuming we can get to an honest court before he destroys us through corrupt channels. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They possessed proof of systematic fraud that could topple Wickham's entire operation. but the banker controlled the local enforcement mechanisms that could prevent their evidence from ever reaching legitimate authorities. As morning light strengthened, other members of their informal resistance began arriving at the ranch. Tom Miller brought word that Hackett's deputies were already moving through town, questioning anyone who'd been seen at the controversial church service. Mrs. Abernathy reported strange men watching her property, clearly preparing for coordinated action. Even Reverend Phillips arrived, his normally peaceful demeanor replaced by grim determination. They came to the church before dawn, he reported. Searched the building, claimed they were looking for stolen property. Tore apart my study, scattered the congregation's pledge documents. They know we're organized now. The pieces of Wickham's strategy were becoming clear. By simultaneously attacking through legal channels and physical intimidation, he was forcing the community to choose between submission and open rebellion. The forged warrant against Lena and Gideon provided justification for federal intervention, while the harassment of their supporters would discourage popular resistance. But it was Pete Morrison, the blacksmith, who brought the most ominous news. Wickham's hired guns from outside the territory, he announced, his face dark with concern. At least a dozen men arrived on the morning stage, all armed, all with the look of professionals. This isn't going to be settled with legal papers. Gideon felt familiar sensations awakening. The tactical awareness that had kept him alive during asymmetric warfare, the mental calculations of terrain, resources, and enemy capabilities that had once made him legendary among frontier fighters. His ranch occupied high ground with clear sightlines in all directions, defensible positions, and multiple escape routes through terrain he knew intimately. "How many people can we count on when the shooting starts?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone understood they'd moved beyond peaceful resistance into something that might require ultimate sacrifice. Dr. Webb spoke first. "My medical oath prevents me from taking up arms, but I'll treat anyone who needs care, regardless of which side they're on." Tom Miller straightened his young shoulders. "I can shoot, Mr. Rourke. Papa taught me well enough. I'm too old to fight," Mrs. Abernathy admitted, "but I can cook for fighting men and tend to the wounded." One by one, each person present committed to roles in what was shaping up to be the most significant confrontation in Dusty Creek's history. Some would fight, others would support, but all would stand together against the corruption that had poisoned their community. But it was Lena who voiced the question that haunted all their plans. Well, what if we win? What if we somehow drive off Wickham and his hired guns, expose the corruption, reclaim our stolen property? What's to prevent them from coming back with federal marshals, territorial militia, enough legitimate authority to crush us completely? Gideon's hand moved to where his cavalry sword waited in the study, understanding that victory in the coming battle would be meaningless without a strategy for lasting change. They needed more than just the ability to fight. They needed proof so compelling, documentation so complete, that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore it. "Martha," he said finally, "how quickly can you make copies of all that evidence? If we're going to risk everything on one confrontation, we need to make sure the truth survives, even if we don't." As the group dispersed to make final preparations, Gideon and Lena stood alone in the pre-dawn darkness, both understanding that their newfound love might not survive the coming storm. But they also understood that some things were worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. The forged document lay on the table between them, its obvious falsehood somehow making their cause feel more righteous. Truth had a power that corruption could never match. They just had to live long enough to see it recognized. Sheriff Hackett's tarnished badge caught the first rays of sunrise as he led 12 armed men up the winding road to Gideon's ranch. The Silver Star had once symbolized justice and protection, but years of corruption had transformed it into something darker, a token of authority without honor, power without principle. Hackett wore it now like a shield against his own conscience, its weight familiar but no longer comforting. The sheriff had pinned that badge to his vest 15 years ago with pride and determination, believing he could make a difference in a frontier territory where law often meant little more than whoever could draw fastest. But Wickham's gold had proven more persuasive than civic duty, and gradually the badge had become nothing more than a prop in theatrical performances of legitimacy. Behind Hackett rode the hired guns Wickham had imported for this final confrontation. Hard. Men with dead eyes who'd sold their services to the highest bidder across 3 territories. They cared nothing for the local politics that had created this situation, viewing the morning's work as just another business transaction in the economy of violence. But it was the presence of federal documents in Hackett's saddlebags that made this morning different from simple intimidation. Wickham had somehow procured what appeared to be legitimate territorial warrants, complete with official seals and signatures that would fool anyone without access to verification. The banker's connections reached further than anyone in Dusty Creek had imagined. From his position on the ranch house porch, Gideon watched the approaching riders with the calm assessment of a man who'd faced similar odds during wartime. His cavalry experience had taught him that superior numbers meant nothing if the enemy lacked commitment to their cause. Mercenaries fought for money, not conviction, and that fundamental difference could be exploited by defenders fighting for everything they held dear. Lena stood beside him, her father's deed secured in her dress pocket, the wooden cross he'd carved visible at her throat. She'd chosen to wear both artifacts like armor against the coming storm, drawing strength from the tangible connections to his memory and values. Her hands were steady despite the gravity of their situation. "You still have time to ride away," Gideon murmured without taking his eyes off the approaching men. "Whatever happens here, it doesn't have to involve you." "It involved me the moment they put me on that auction block," she replied firmly. "Besides, where would I go? This is home now." Around the ranch buildings, their supporters had taken carefully planned positions. Tom Miller crouched behind the barn with his father's hunting rifle, young hands steady despite his racing heart. Dr. Webb waited in the root cellar with medical supplies, ready to treat casualties from either side. Martha Crenshaw had positioned herself in the main house with copies of their evidence, prepared to ensure the truth survived, even if they didn't. But it was the presence of families from town that transformed this from a simple standoff into something approaching a popular uprising. Mrs. Abernathy had brought her adult sons, armed with determination and hunting weapons. The mercantile owner stood with his wife and eldest boy, all carrying rifles that had seen better days but remained functional. Even some of the town's children had come, not to fight, but to witness the moment their community chose courage over fear. Hackett called a halt 50 yards from the main house, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid easy rifle. A range, his mercenaries spread out in a practiced formation, their professional competence evident in every movement. "Gideon Rourke," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying artificial authority. "I have warrants for your arrest and that of the woman Lena Calder. You're both charged with fraud, conspiracy, and harboring stolen property. Surrender peacefully and you'll be treated fairly." "Fairly?" Gideon's voice carried across the morning air with contempt. "Like Timothy Henderson was treated fairly. Like the families you've been evicting were treated fairly." "That's legitimate bank business," Hackett replied, but his tone lacked conviction. "These warrants are signed by Territorial Judge Morrison himself." Lena stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Judge Morrison died 6 months ago, Sheriff. Even you should know that." The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Several of Hackett's hired men shifted uncomfortably, understanding they'd been lied to about the legitimacy of their mission. Mercenaries would fight for money, but most had standards about obvious illegality that might bring federal scrutiny down on their heads. It was Reverend Phillips who provided the next surprise, emerging from behind the ranch house with his worn Bible in hand. The preacher had positioned himself where everyone could see him, his presence serving as a moral witness to whatever followed. "Sheriff Hackett," the Reverend called out, his voice carrying the authority of moral conviction. "I've known you since you were a boy in my Sunday school. Your father was a good man who taught you right from wrong. Is this really how you want his name remembered?" The question struck home. Hackett's face flushed with something that might have been shame, his hand unconsciously moving to the badge. That had once meant something pure, but Wickham's influence ran too deep for sentiment to overcome greed. "I have my orders," Hackett said finally. "Stand down or face the consequences." "Then you'll have to come and take us," Gideon replied, his hand resting casually on the Colt revolver at his hip. "But understand this, we're not going quietly, and we're not going alone." The standoff stretched between them like a taut rope, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Everyone present understood. They stood at a crossroads that would define Dusty Creek's future. Would they submit to corruption backed by fraudulent authority, or would they fight for the principles that made communities worth defending? It was one of Wickham's hired guns who finally broke the tension, spurring his horse forward with professional confidence. "Enough talking," he called out. "Time to end this farce." But as he reached for his weapon, the sound of distant hoofbeats announced the arrival of riders from an unexpected direction. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon suggested that the morning's confrontation was about to become far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Gideon smiled grimly, recognizing the tactical significance of the moment. In warfare, timing often mattered more than firepower, and sometimes salvation arrived just when hope seemed lost. The telegram that changed everything had arrived in Denver 3 days earlier, its urgent message crackling across telegraph wires with the authority of federal law enforcement. Territorial Marshal William Garrett had received hundreds of such communications during his 20-year career, but this one carried documentation so comprehensive, evidence so damning, that it demanded immediate personal attention. The yellow paper bore the official seal of the Territorial Governor's Office, but its contents came from an unexpected source: Martha Crenshaw, schoolteacher of Dusty Creek, writing on behalf of concerned citizens who had compiled irrefutable proof of systematic corruption in their local government. Attached to her report were affidavits, financial records, forged documents, and witness testimonies that painted a picture of criminal conspiracy spanning multiple counties. Now Marshal Garrett rode at the head of 6 federal deputies, their badges gleaming with legitimate authority as they crested the hill overlooking Gideon's ranch. Below them, the standoff between local corruption and community resistance was about to reach its violent conclusion. Unless federal intervention could prevent bloodshed while ensuring justice. "That's them," Deputy Collins observed, studying the scene through field glasses. Armed men facing off, just like the telegram described. Sheriff's badge down there, but something doesn't feel right about it. Marshal Garrett had learned to trust his instincts during 2 decades of frontier law enforcement. The formation below suggested professional mercenaries rather than legitimate peace officers, while the defensive positions around the ranch buildings spoke of desperate people making a principled stand rather than criminals resisting lawful arrest. The arrival of federal officials transformed the tactical situation completely. Hackett's hired guns, who'd been prepared to overwhelm local resistance through superior numbers and firepower, suddenly found themselves facing legitimate federal authority with questions they couldn't answer and documents they couldn't defend. "Sheriff Hackett," Marshal Garrett called out as his party approached, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law. "I'm Marshal William Garrett, Territorial Division. I need to examine those warrants you're executing." The request struck Hackett like a physical blow. He'd counted on intimidating local resistance before any outside authority could intervene, but now found himself facing the very federal scrutiny that Wickham had assured him would never materialize. "Marshal," Hackett replied, struggling to maintain composure, "these are local matters, properly handled through territorial channels." not when they involve interstate mail fraud, forgery of federal documents, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, Garrett responded firmly. Those warrants, Sheriff, now. As Hackett reluctantly produced the fabricated documents, Deputy Collins dismounted and began examining the hired gunmen with professional interest. Their lack of badges, non-standard weapons, and obvious discomfort with federal scrutiny marked them clearly as mercenaries rather than legitimate law enforcement. "Sir," Collins reported quietly to Marshal Garrett, "these men aren't sworn officers. They're hired guns, most likely brought in from outside the territory." The Marshal studied the warrants with the experienced eye of a man who'd seen every form of frontier fraud. The forged signatures were obvious to anyone familiar with territorial paperwork, while the impossible dates and dead judges' authorizations made the documents laughable as legal instruments. "Mr. Rourke," Garrett called toward the ranch house, "I believe you and Miss Calder need to hear this. These warrants are fraudulent, poorly forged documents with no legal standing whatsoever." The words hit the assembled mercenaries like thunderbolts. Men who'd agreed to enforce what they'd been told were legitimate arrests suddenly realized they'd been recruited for criminal activity that could result in federal prosecution. Professional gunmen might risk violence for adequate compensation, but few were willing to face federal conspiracy charges for any amount of money. One by one, Wickham's hired guns began backing away from the confrontation, their professional instincts warning them that the situation had become untenable. Without their mercenary support, Sheriff Hackett found himself alone and exposed, his corruption finally facing the reckoning he'd avoided for so long. But it was Martha Crenshaw who provided the most devastating blow to Wickham's empire. Emerging from the ranch house with her carefully organized evidence, she approached Marshal Garrett with the methodical precision that had made her an effective teacher and devastating documentarian. "Marshal, I believe you'll find these materials relevant to your investigation," she said, producing bound volumes of evidence that represented months of careful record-keeping. Financial records showing systematic fraud, forged signatures on loan documents, witness testimonies regarding intimidation and violence, and documentation of property seizures based on manufactured defaults. Garrett accepted the materials with growing amazement. In his experience, frontier corruption typically involved crude schemes with minimal documentation. What Martha had compiled represented the most comprehensive case file he'd ever seen prepared by civilian investigators. "This level of evidence suggests federal crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions," he observed, flipping through pages of meticulous documentation. "Bank fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations. We're looking at dozens of felony charges." Dr. Webb stepped forward with his own contribution to the federal case. "Marshal, I've been documenting the human cost of this corruption. Families driven to poverty, children suffering from artificial scarcity, individuals who died from treatable conditions because they couldn't afford medical care after losing their property to fraudulent foreclosures." The physician's testimony added moral weight to the legal evidence, transforming abstract financial crimes into human tragedies that demanded justice. It was Lena who provided the final piece of evidence that would ultimately destroy Wickham's criminal empire. Producing her father's deed from her dress pocket, she handed it to Marshal Garrett with quiet dignity. "This document proves that my family's land was owned free and clear before my father's death," she explained. "Any debt obligations, banker. Wickham claims were manufactured through forged amendments to loan agreements. This deed, combined with the evidence Miss Crenshaw has compiled, should prove systematic fraud affecting dozens of families throughout the territory." As Marshal Garrett examined the deed, comparing it with samples of Wickham's forged documents, the scope of the criminal conspiracy became clear. This wasn't simply local corruption, but organized fraud that had been systematically stealing land and property from legitimate owners across multiple counties. "Sheriff Hackett," the marshal said finally, his voice carrying the weight of federal Authority, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, abuse of office, and violation of citizens' civil rights. Your badge, sir." The moment when Hackett removed his tarnished badge marked the end of an era for Dusty Creek. As he handed over the symbol of authority he'd corrupted, something fundamental shifted in the community's relationship with law and order. But even as justice began to unfold, everyone present understood that Wickham himself remained at large, potentially preparing new schemes to avoid accountability. The banker's arrest would require additional evidence and careful coordination. Between federal and territorial authorities, Marshal Garrett seemed to read their thoughts. "Don't worry about Wickham," he said grimly. "Based on this evidence, we'll have territorial warrants issued within the week. Men like him always leave trails when they think they're too powerful to face consequences." As the hired gunmen dispersed, and Hackett was taken into federal custody, the community that had prepared for violence found itself celebrating justice instead. Their collective courage had attracted federal attention. Their documentation had provided the tools for prosecution, and their willingness to stand together had finally broken the cycle of corruption that had dominated their lives. For the first time in years, the people of Dusty Creek could imagine a future built on law rather than fear, justice rather than power, and community rather than exploitation. The community quilting frame had sat unused in the church basement for nearly 5 years, its wooden joints loose and fabric stretched thin from neglect. But on this crisp October morning, it dominated the center of Dusty Creek's main hall, surrounded by women whose hands remembered the ancient rhythms of cooperative creation. The frame itself told the story of better times, crafted by the town's founding families when neighbors still believed in shared burdens and collective joy. Martha Crenshaw guided the intricate pattern taking shape beneath their needles, a design that would commemorate the community's transformation from despair to hope. Each square represented a family that had been restored to prosperity, each stitch a small act of kindness that had contributed to their collective salvation. "Mrs. Henderson, could you pass the blue thread?" asked Sarah Miller, whose family's debt had been among the first mysteriously paid by Gideon's anonymous generosity. "I want to finish Timothy's Square before the dedication ceremony." The boy, whose beating had crystallized the community's resistance, now ran freely through the streets, his injuries healed and his spirit restored. His square would occupy the center of the quilt, surrounded by symbols representing every family that had chosen courage over submission during their darkest hour. 3 weeks had passed since Marshal Garrett's dramatic intervention, and the changes in Dusty Creek seemed to multiply daily. Banker Wickham had been arrested at the territorial capital while attempting to flee to California with stolen funds. His elaborate scheme had collapsed like a house of cards once federal investigators began examining his financial records. The Mercantile now extended fair credit to struggling families, its owner having discovered that honest business practices could be more profitable than exploitation. Dr. Webb had established a community medical fund, ensuring that no family would face bankruptcy due to medical emergencies. Even the saloon had transformed into a meeting place for planning cooperative ventures rather than drowning sorrows in cheap whiskey. But it was the barn raising at the Calder homestead that truly symbolized the community's rebirth. Lena's father's property had been restored to her ownership through federal intervention, and the townspeople had volunteered en masse to help her rebuild what had been destroyed during the fraudulent foreclosure. Gideon directed the construction with the same tactical precision he'd once applied to military campaigns, but now his strategic thinking served creation rather than destruction. Young men who'd never worked together before collaborated seamlessly, their shared purpose overcoming old grudges and social divisions. "Lena," called Tom Miller from his position on the roof beam, "your papa would be mighty proud to see this. The whole town working together to restore what was stolen from your family. She looked up from her work sorting lumber, her heart full with gratitude and something deeper, a sense of belonging that she'd feared was lost forever. The cabin taking shape would be more than just her new home. It would stand as proof that justice could prevail when good people chose to act collectively. Gideon appeared at her side, his sleeve rolled up and hands dirty from honest labor. The past weeks had transformed him as much as they'd changed the town. The isolated, grief-stricken rancher had become a community leader whose quiet strength inspired others to discover their own courage. "The foundation's solid," he reported, gesturing toward the carefully laid stones that would support the new structure. "Built to last for generations, just like your father would have wanted. Just like we're building here," she replied, her gesture encompassing not just the construction site, but the entire community effort surrounding them. Something that will endure beyond our own lives. The barn raising had attracted families from neighboring settlements, drawn by stories of Dusty Creek's remarkable transformation. Word was spreading throughout the territory about a town that had successfully resisted corruption and built something better from the ruins of despair. Reverend Phillips moved among the workers with renewed purpose, offering encouragement and settling minor disputes with the wisdom of a man who'd rediscovered his calling. His church had become the natural center for community planning, its doors open daily for meetings, education, and mutual support. "You know," he told a group of men taking their lunch break in the shade, "I used to think my job was just preparing people for the next life. Now I understand it's also about helping them build something worthwhile in this one." The quilting frame in the community hall represented more than just women's work. It symbolized the patient, careful process of weaving individual lives into a stronger collective fabric. Each stitch required attention and skill, but the final product would provide warmth and beauty that no single thread could achieve alone. 6 months had passed since the mining company controversy had tested their community's unity, and the resolution they'd eventually reached demonstrated both the strength and flexibility of their democratic principles. Rather than accepting or rejecting the proposal entirely, they'd negotiated a limited partnership that allowed small-scale extraction under strict environmental oversight, with profits shared equally among all families rather than concentrated. In corporate hands, the compromise hadn't satisfied everyone completely, but it had proven that their community could navigate complex decisions without fracturing into irreconcilable factions. More importantly, it had generated the resources needed to fund ambitious projects like the new school, which represented their commitment to investing in future generations rather than simply enjoying present prosperity. Lena stood before her classroom, watching 23 children of various ages settle into their seats with the eager anticipation that marked the beginning of any educational adventure. These weren't just students. They were the living proof that their community's transformation could be sustained across generations. Timothy Henderson, now 12 and fully recovered from his ordeal with Hackett's deputies, served as an unofficial leader among the older children. His experience had matured him beyond his years, but it had also given him a deep appreciation for justice and community solidarity that influenced his classmates. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, raising his hand with characteristic enthusiasm, "are we really going to learn about the law and government like you promised? Pa says understanding how things work is the best way to make sure they work right." "Indeed we are, Timothy," Lena replied, her heart swelling with pride at the boy's intellectual curiosity. "We'll study not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also civics, ethics, and the skills needed to participate effectively in democratic governance." The curriculum she'd developed with input from territorial education officials represented something revolutionary for frontier schooling. Rather than focusing solely on basic literacy and numeracy, it emphasized critical thinking, moral reasoning, and practical skills needed for cooperative community building. But it was the presence of adult students that made this educational experiment truly unprecedented. 3 evenings each week, the schoolhouse filled with parents and grandparents who'd never had opportunities for formal education, but now wanted to develop skills that would help them participate more effectively in their community's governance. Martha Grenshaw, who'd taken a position as Lena's assistant teacher, worked primarily with the adult education program. Her patience and methodical approach proved perfect for teaching middle-aged farmers to read legal documents, calculate fair interest rates, and understand the territorial political processes that affected their daily lives. Education isn't just about individual advancement, Martha explained to a group of skeptical parents who questioned the value of spending evenings in school. It's about ensuring that our community can govern itself wisely, resist future attempts at exploitation, and pass on the values that saved us from corruption. The school's success had attracted attention from throughout the territory, with education officials visiting regularly to study their innovative approaches. But it was the impact on the students themselves that truly measured their achievement. Children, who might have left school early to work on family farms, now stayed through advanced coursework, knowing that education would enhance rather than replace their agricultural contributions. Young people began discussing plans for college, careers in law or medicine, and ways to bring outside knowledge back to benefit their community. Gideon often stopped by during his afternoon rounds, ostensibly to check on building maintenance, but actually to observe the remarkable transformation taking place within those walls. Watching Lena teach filled him with pride that went beyond husbandly affection. He was witnessing the fulfillment of dreams they'd discussed during their courtship, the practical application of values they'd fought to preserve. But it was during one of these visits that he noticed something that made his heart race with unexpected joy. Lena moved differently now, with a careful grace that spoke of precious cargo carried within. When their eyes met across the classroom, her smile confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. They would soon welcome their own contribution to the next generation. That evening, as they walked home through streets illuminated by new gas lamps funded through mining revenues, Lena shared the news he'd already guessed. "Spring," she said simply, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Our child will arrive with the apple blossoms, just like our new life began." The timing seemed perfect in its symbolism. Their baby would be born into a community that had proven its ability to survive challenges, grow from setbacks, and build something lasting from the ashes of corruption. The child would inherit not just property, but principles, not just prosperity, but purpose. As they reached their home, Gideon paused to look back at the school where the bell tower stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test their community's resilience and values. But tonight, with the promise of new life growing within his wife and the evidence of their community's success surrounding them, he felt confident that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The school bell would ring again in the morning, calling children to learn and adults to grow, reminding everyone who heard it that education was indeed the foundation of freedom, and that freedom, once earned, required constant cultivation to flourish. Their story was far from over, but it had reached a point where continuation seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The seeds they'd planted in desperation had grown into something that could weather any storm, as long as people remembered the principles that had made growth possible in the first place: love, justice, community, and hope. These simple values had transformed a dying town into a beacon of possibility. Now they would guide the next generation in building something even better from the foundation their parents had laid. The child's cradle that dominated the corner of Gideon and Lena's bedroom had been crafted by every skilled woodworker in Dusty Creek, each man contributing his finest work to create something worthy of the baby who would symbolize their community's future. and carved from oak, taken from the same tree that had provided Lena's engagement ring. The cradle bore intricate designs that told the story of their transformation. Wildflowers for renewal, linked hands for community, and a rising sun for hope. Eternal. On this warm April morning, exactly 1 year after their wedding and 2 years since that fateful auction that had changed everything, Lena held their newborn son against her chest while watching the annual Freedom Day celebration unfold. In the town square below, the tradition had emerged spontaneously the previous year, when families began gathering on the anniversary of Gideon's rescue to reflect on how far they'd traveled and renew their commitment to the principles that had saved them. Little Jonathan Rourke, named for Lena's father, slept peacefully despite the joyful noise rising from the streets. His birth, 3 days earlier, had been attended by Dr. Webb and half the women in town, all eager to welcome the child who represented their community's faith in the future. The boy would grow up in a world his parents could scarcely have imagined during their darkest hours, surrounded by people who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and love demanded active expression. "Look at that," Gideon marveled, pointing toward the memorial garden where children played among the flowers that had replaced the auction block. "Timothy Henderson is organizing them into some kind of pageant. That boy's going to be a leader someday." Indeed, young Timothy had appointed himself director of the children's reenactment of their community's salvation story, complete with costumes made from feed sacks and enthusiasm that more than compensated for any lack of theatrical sophistication. His sister played Lena, standing bravely on a makeshift auction block, while the boy, portraying Gideon, rode to her rescue on a wooden hobby horse. The performance would have been merely charming if not for its deeper significance. These children had grown up hearing the story of their town's redemption, understanding from their earliest years that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort, principle over profit. But it was the presence of visitors that truly marked how far their influence had spread. Families from throughout the territory had traveled to Dusty Creek for Freedom Day, drawn by stories of a community that had successfully resisted corruption and built something better from the ruins. Many came seeking advice for their own struggling settlements, while others simply wanted to witness proof that such transformation was possible. Among the visitors was a delegation from the territorial capital, including the governor himself, who had come to study their cooperative model for potential application elsewhere. The legal framework they'd developed, balancing individual rights with community welfare, was being discussed in legislative sessions as a possible template for territorial-wide reforms. "Mrs. Rourke," said Governor Patterson, joining them on their porch where they watched the celebrations, "your community has become famous throughout the region. We're receiving inquiries from settlements as far away as Montana Territory, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms." Lena adjusted baby Jonathan's blanket before responding. "Governor, I think the most important thing we learned is that change has to come from within. We couldn't have imposed these reforms from outside. They only worked because people chose them freely after experiencing the consequences of corruption." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Crenshaw, who had been coordinating the day's educational displays. Her documentation of their community's transformation had become a model for civic record-keeping, with her methodical approach being studied by historians and political scientists throughout the territory. "Lena! Gideon!" she announced breathlessly. "You need to see what's happening at the school. The children have organized their own constitutional convention, complete with debate about voting rights and fair representation." The sight that greeted them at the schoolhouse was both amusing and inspiring. 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 16, sat in solemn deliberation around tables arranged like a legislative chamber. They were drafting what they called the Children's Constitution, establishing rules for playground governance that reflected the democratic principles they'd absorbed from community meetings. Article 3, declared young Sarah Miller, reading from a carefully written document, states that no child shall be excluded from games based on family wealth, personal appearance, or previous mistakes. All children shall be judged by their character and treated with equal dignity. The innocence of their language couldn't hide the sophistication of their thinking. These children had internalized lessons about justice, fairness, and community responsibility that many adults struggled to understand. As evening approached and the formal celebrations wound down, families gathered for the traditional closing ceremony at the memorial garden. Reverend Phillips offered a prayer of gratitude for their transformation, while Dr. Webb read the names of all those who had contributed to their community's healing, including, with poignant emotion, those who had died during the years of corruption, but whose memory continued to inspire their survivors. But it was Gideon who provided the day's most meaningful moment. Standing before the assembled crowd with his newborn son in his arms, he spoke words that would be remembered and repeated for generations to come. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, 2 years ago, I came to this town expecting to buy horses and rode away with something far more valuable. The knowledge that one person's choice to act with kindness can transform an entire community. He looked down at Jonathan, sleeping peacefully despite the crowd's attention. This child will grow up in a world we helped create, but the work isn't finished. Every generation must choose anew whether to preserve what's good, improve what's imperfect, and resist what's corrupt. The baby stirred in his father's arms, tiny hands grasping at the evening air as if reaching for the future his parents had secured through their courage and sacrifice. May he inherit not just prosperity, but the wisdom to use it well, Lena added, joining her husband before their community. May he learn that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we contribute to the common good. As the ceremony concluded and families began dispersing to their homes, the wooden cradle waiting in the Rourke house seemed to pulse with symbolic significance. It would hold their son during his most vulnerable months, but it also represented something larger, the community's commitment to nurturing and protecting the values that had made their transformation possible. The story that had begun with human degradation at an auction block had come full circle to new life in a cradle crafted by loving hands. From despair to hope, from isolation to community, from corruption to justice, the circle was complete. But the story continued. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to test their resolve and deepen their commitment to the principles that had saved them. But tonight, as baby Jonathan slept in his community-crafted cradle and his parents watched over the town that had become their extended family, the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Love had conquered greed, community had triumphed over corruption, and hope had proven stronger than despair. The legacy they would leave their son was not measured in acres or dollars, but in the knowledge that ordinary people, choosing to act with extraordinary courage, could change the world, one kindness at a time.